Brother, I'm Dying by Edwige Danticat. Chapter 24, titled Transition. There's a stage in labor called transition when the baby, preparing to separate from the mother, twists and turns to pass through the birth canal. I am sure there is a similar stage for exiting life, though it might be less definitive. Still, as I go into labor, thankfully, with a risen placenta, each time I wish for an easy transition for my daughter and myself, I wish the same for my father. Our midwife, Colleen, encouraged me to add some personal touches to the lavender labor room at the birthing center, so I brought 2 old photos of my mother and father. In his picture, my father is a handsome, serious-looking 26 years old. He's wearing a pale jacket, a high-collared shirt, a pencil-thin tie, and tortoiseshell glasses. My mother in hers is wearing a check blouse with a giant button on the front. Her hair is straightened and her round face framed by small, star-shaped drop earrings. When Colleen sees my mother's picture, she thinks my mother is me. I looked at my parents' sepia-toned faces intermittently during the 16 hours that I walked, lay down, sat in a tub, on a ball, on the toilet, in constant agony. How could my mother have done this 4 times? I wondered. My mother once briefly told me the story of my birth. I was nearly born in a pebbled courtyard outside the maternity ward of Port-au-Prince's General Hospital. My father was out of the city for his work, and my mother, fiercely independent, proud and alone, was one of nearly a dozen women who were doubled over and wailing in the yard. There were too many of them and not enough doctors. No one even examined them until their babies crowned. During her 4 hours of active labor, my mother tried very hard not to wish death upon herself. She staggered in and out of consciousness until a doctor finally surfaced and rushed her into the delivery room. When my daughter was born, her face blood-tinted, her eyelids swollen with tiny light pink patches that Colleen, the midwife, called angel kisses, her body coiled around itself as if to echo the tightness of her tiny fists, I instantly saw it as one of many separations to come. She was leaving my body and going into the world where she would spend the rest of her life moving away from me. Groggy and exhausted, I asked Colleen, "Is it normal for me to think this?" "Maybe you're one of those women who enjoys being pregnant," she said. It wasn't so much that I enjoyed being pregnant. I simply liked the fact that for a while my daughter and I had been inseparable. Looking at her tiny face, her bow-shaped lips so red that her father said she looked like she was wearing lipstick, I remembered a message a girlfriend had sent me when my first niece and nephew, Bob's daughter Nadira and Carl's son Ezekiel, were born. "May you be reposoir," she'd written, "a place where children can rest." I needed to rest myself, but I also wanted to speak to my daughter, cradle her, sing to her, inhale her mixed blood and soap smell, watch her ever so slightly open her eyes and tighten her mouth as she tried to make sense of all the new sounds around her, my husband's laughter, my mother-in-law's comparisons with relatives, both living and gone. I thought she most resembled my mother and pointed at the picture to prove it, but I also saw traces of my father, who my mother says was too frightened to hold me and my brothers when we were babies, but who would later hold my brother's children, laugh, and sing to them. I grieved for Uncle Joseph and Tante Denise, who would never hold my daughter, and for my Haitian cousins, including Tante Z's son Richard, who might never know her. Or maybe she would return one day to Legoan or to Bel Air to declare in heavily accented words that they were her family. She might be honored by their nods of acknowledgement, the way they'd be forced to consent. Of course, I see the resemblance. You do look like your great-grandmother's around the cheeks. You do have the high forehead of your grandfather's kin. And hopefully those cheeks and that calabash-shaped forehead would gain her entry. Looking into my daughter's eyes, I thought of my mother, who had faced these first hours alone after I was born. She had been made no promises, been offered no guarantees that either she or I would live past that night. If something had been ruptured inside of her, no one would have noticed. If something had been broken inside of newborn me, perhaps no one but my mother would have cared. My daughter's quiet yet well-monitored first night was perhaps the one my mother had dreamed of for me, for herself, a dream of kind words, kisses, flowers. "What have you decided to call her?" asked Colleen. "My husband and I had discussed it. There seemed no other possible choice." "Mira," I said, "for my father." After patiently waiting his turn to hold her, my husband held out his hand. I was also reluctant to let this Mira go. Hopefully, I'll have an uninterrupted lifetime with her, I thought, a lifetime to plant some things that had been uprooted in me and uproot others that had been planted. But surrender her I did, with an urgent wish to also hand her over to my father. "Look, Papa," I'd say, "you've waited for her. You've lived long enough to see her. Today is not just her day, but all of ours, and we're not the only ones who will cradle and protect her. You will also hold and comfort us. She will also hold and comfort us. She too will be our reposwa, our sacred place to rest." I said no such thing when we actually brought my daughter to meet my father 3 weeks later, 5 months after my uncle's death. Standing at his bedside, I was stunned by how motionless he seemed, how much he appeared to have aged. The room too was stripped of all signs of verve. The oak-framed queen-size bed he once shared with my mother had now been replaced by a narrow hospital bed that allowed him to prop himself up at the push of a button. My husband lowered the bed's railing and slipped our daughter into my father's scrawny arms. I thought that at nearly 9 pounds she might prove too heavy a weight for him, but he raised her face close to his and planted a kiss on her forehead. Her eyes were closed. She was sleeping. "Do you know how long I've been waiting to meet you?" he said, "and you're not even awake." A smile formed on my father's lips, which proved too much of a strain. He handed Mira back to my husband and began to cough. After my husband returned to Miami during the month that Mira and I would spend with my father, each time he held her, his smile would threaten to dissolve into a coughing spell, and after just a few minutes I'd have to take her back. Until one morning when he'd walked out of bed by himself and over to the recliner by the window. "Let me hold her," he said, "while you take a picture for posterity." I ran to my bedroom and grabbed my camera. I'd been hesitant to photograph Mira and my father during the brief moments he'd had her in his arms. I wanted him to enjoy those times as best he could without worrying about posing. Besides, as he'd grown sicker and thinner, he'd asked us not to photograph him. He wanted to be remembered, he said, the way he looked when he was well. "Look at us, the 2 Miras," he said. Staring into the camera. In the first frame, my daughter's eyes were half open, as though she's struggling to stay awake. "I'm really touched that you named her Mira," he said, as I snapped another picture. "Now, even when I'm gone, and we all can say that, even those of us who are not sick, even when I'm gone, the name will stay behind." My daughter was now fast asleep. For the next shot, my father looked down at her and smiled, a smile that miraculously did not trigger his cough. Later that week, we celebrated my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, my brothers and I, our spouses, and a few close friends, by gathering around my father's bed and toasting him and my mother. My father was too weak to raise a glass of apple cider to his lips. Sweating profusely, he tried to say something but couldn't. My mother quickly asked us to clear the room. He'd grown too hot, to give him some air. Soon after we'd left the room, a friend of my father's from church told me, why don't you let him go? Tell him it's okay to go." "I couldn't," I told her, "because I didn't want him to go. I didn't want him to die." During the day, my father hardly ate anything. At night, he couldn't sleep. Whenever he took a sleeping pill and dozed off for a few hours, he spoke loudly, incomprehensibly, in rapid staccato speech. There were people, long dead, standing at his bedside, he could explain the next morning. His mother in a red dress, his father singing, his sister laughing. They were keeping him awake. "Stay with me a while," he'd tell my mother and me after he'd said his evening prayers. Then he'd dismiss us a half hour later, saying, "I suppose you have to go. You can't sit here all night." We would go reluctantly, leaving our doors open so we could easily hear the slightest stir. He would get hot, then cold in the middle of the night, and call on us to open or close the windows. Carl and Bob would come and bathe him, rub medicated lotions over the scaly patches of psoriasis on his skin, some as raw as open wounds. They would cut his hair, trim his curved, oxygen-deprived fingernails and toenails. I'd still watch his game shows and movies with him, and, when we could, would debate the news from Haiti and elsewhere. One afternoon, while my daughter was sleeping, I was sitting with him, and my mother was downstairs in the kitchen when he told me to ask her to cook him some plain, long-grain white rice for supper. Early in his illness, he decided that rice grains were aggravating his cough, so he abruptly stopped eating them. Overjoyed that he was actually craving food, I shared the news with my mother, who was downstairs cooking. "Guess what?" I said. "Papa wants some rice." My mother sent me back to ask exactly how he wanted his rice prepared. Could she soak it in chicken broth, mix it with black or brown beans or mushrooms, sprinkle it with shredded cashews? Would he mind if she lubricated it with butter or margarine to add some extra calories and taste, stirred in chunks of sausage or bacon for much needed protein? Perhaps he wanted some fresh vegetables thrown in for fiber. He only wanted a small bowl of the plainest white rice she could possibly prepare, he said. He even provided a shorthand recipe. Cup of rice, water, drop of salt, spoonful of vegetable oil so nothing sticks to the pan, boil it all. My father had always been a picky eater. However, he had only learned to cook during his early years in the United States while my mother was still in Haiti. When she joined him 2 years later, the first thing he did was cook for her. My mother's first Brooklyn meal was very much like Bob's and mine. It consisted of stewed chicken, fried sweet plantains, which my mother loves, and diriak pois, rice and beans. For a while, each time someone would visit from Haiti, my father would help cook that same meal, just as he had for us. His welcome repast, he called it, because he wanted his visitors to taste something that had buffered his transition to immigrant life. And even if their stays were not meant to be as long as his, he hoped that they would feel, as he did, that one could easily return home simply by lifting a fork to one's lips. I watched as my mother prepared my father's rice, as she dropped the contents of an overflowing measuring cup into a pot of boiling water. A few grains spilled over the side, turning black in the burner's blue flames. Her hands trembled as she lowered the lid to trap some steam to prevent the rice from becoming sticky. My father liked his rice light and fluffy, not separate. If given the choice, he'd rather eat it al dente than soggy. Since he'd gone so long without a taste, the possibility of disappointing him weighed heavily on my mother. When the rice was done, my mother searched a cabinet filled with her special occasion dishes, the kind she used only when she had company, and pulled out a white porcelain plate with 2 giant cherries sketched in the middle. The cherries overlapped in a way that made them look like one large heart, and as my mother heaped the rice on top of them, they seemed like a coded message from a woman who was beyond taking ordinary moments with her husband for granted. I took the rice up to my father on the bright yellow tray on which all of his meals were served. My mother added a tall glass of ice-cold water, which my father had requested at the last minute. When I walked into the room, my father's face lit up, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. He was sitting in the recliner, his eyes glued to the plate. I leaned over to place the tray in front of him. He was covered in 4 layers of blankets, which were doing the work that muscle and fat had once done for his body. What seemed like room temperature to someone else could feel glacial to my father. The forward sway of my body made the water glass skid across the tray, spilling the chilled water into my father's lap. The water soaked through the blankets onto his pajamas, leaking into the sponge padding beneath him. My father let out a loud cry. I quickly pulled the tray aside, resting it on the dresser behind the television. Even as he moaned and tried to wriggle away from the soaked sheets, my father's eyes trailed the plate of rice that was now cooling off just a few feet away. My mother heard my father's screams from downstairs and rushed to his rescue. She quickly peeled back the blankets, all the while shouting for me to get her a towel and dry pajamas from the closet. My father's pained utterances quickly went from moans to wails. "Oh, God," he called out tearfully. "Oh, God." An hour later, my father was still trembling under no fewer than 3 piled-up dry comforters. "It feels," he said, as though I'd been sleeping on a bed of ice for days. It took some oxygen and a nebulizer to stabilize him. By then the rice was cold, and he showed no desire for it. "I'm sorry, Papa," I said, trembling myself at his bedside. I had terrible visions of watching him freeze to death as a result of my carelessness. It was an accident. He raised one bony hand from under the comforters to grab mine. "I know you didn't mean to do it." "I'm sorry I ruined the rice for you," I said. "I know how much you wanted it." He hesitated, then pressed my hand harder. "I didn't want it so much as I wanted to want it," he said. "The truth is, I don't feel hungry or thirsty anymore. I just wish I did." It pained me much more to hear this than it did to have heard him say a few weeks before that he dreamed of Grampe Nozial and Grame Larvana and Tantino, his long-dead father, mother, and sister, standing at his bedside. It pained me more than the way that he'd been starting every sentence with "Le Malais," when I'm gone. Sitting beside him that afternoon, I remembered being angry with him 2 Thanksgivings before when he'd sat down at the dinner table and left his plate untouched. "There's nothing here I want to eat," he had declared. After cooking for 2 days, my mother had been devastated by what she'd considered a blatant condemnation of her cooking. But what we didn't know then, and what my father himself wasn't aware of at the time, was that he already had a disease that was slowly eating away at his body, including his yearning for food and his reliance on it to sustain him. We could smell it before we saw it. A new batch of long-grain white rice prepared by my mother. This time she brought it up herself, and not on the bed tray, but on a round silver server from the special cabinet. My father raised himself on the bed to receive it, and as soon as my mother handed him the spoon, for he always ate his rice with a spoon, he immediately dived in. He barely chewed at all, simply bouncing the grains from cheek to cheek, then swallowing quickly. Had I not known, I would have thought him famished, ravenous, even insatiable, and perhaps he was. Or maybe he was desperately trying to nourish himself with something recognizable and familiar. When he was halfway done, my father handed me the plate. "Do you want some?" he asked. "There's more in the kitchen," my mother said. "She can have some later. This is for you." "Let her have some," he insisted. I reached over and took the plate. Using my father's spoon, I piled a mound of rice into my mouth. It was plain but flavorful. I suspected that my mother had slipped in some broth or margarine, even a few drops of coconut milk. I realized that afternoon that for nearly a year, while my mother, brothers, and I constantly carried food up to my father, we had rarely eaten with him. Somehow it hadn't occurred to me that he missed sharing a table or a plate, passing a spice or a spoon, but he did. Just as he missed seeing certain faces and places and hearing certain voices that neither his friends nor family nor the television could successfully transport to his room. I returned to Miami with my daughter the next morning. 3 days later, Bob called me before daybreak. I knew from the timing that it was not good news. "He's gone, isn't he?" I asked. "He's gone," he replied. I think now that my father waited for me to leave, that he did not want me to hold Mira with one hand and his corpse with the other. The night my father died, my mother heard the same type of rapid staccato speech coming from his room that she'd now grown accustomed to. In the middle of it, he somehow managed to shout her name. She ran into the room and found him sweating and gasping for breath. She made sure the oxygen tube was properly placed in his nose and tried to slip a nebulizer tube between his lips. "Me pop kamba," he told her. "I can't." His eyes rolled back in his head, which fell back limp against his pillow. My mother called Bob, who came over, and after calling my father a few times, "Pop!" and after placing a nebulizer mask over his nose and mouth and getting no response, called 911. When the paramedics arrived, they asked Bob if my father had a DNR. Bob said no. A clear measure of our inability to release him, we hadn't encouraged him to make one even after the doctor at Columbia Presbyterian had suggested it. The paramedics removed my father's clothes, laid him on the wooden floor in his room naked, and pounded at his chest for an hour. Even if they had succeeded in resuscitating him, he probably would have had a couple of broken ribs. Neither Bob nor my mother could stay and watch, so as the paramedics worked on my father, they went downstairs, where they were interviewed by a policeman. The policeman, the distant outside authority figure, was a curious presence. Was this standard practice in all American deaths, even expected ones, like my father's? I asked my mother and brother. It was, the policeman had explained, a measure to make sure there was no foul play, no euthanasia involved. How long had my father been sick? The policeman asked my mother and brother. What medications was he taking? When I was home with my father just a few days before, lying with my daughter in the same bed I'd slept in as a teenager, there were nights when I stayed awake wondering what I'd do if I woke up the next morning and found my father dead. During those nights, heeding his friend's call to let him go, I would do a kind of mental rehearsal of several possibilities. When it seemed irreversible and absolutely definite that my father was dying, I would finally tell him to go. Don't be afraid, I'd say. It's okay. We love you. We will always remember you. Then, naming each of us, I would tell him that we'd be fine, and so would he. My mom will be fine, I'd say. Kelly will be fine. Carl will be fine. Carl's son Ezekiel will be fine. His daughter Zora will be fine. Bob will be fine. And his daughter Nadira will be fine. I will be fine, and Mira will be fine. Then I would lean down and kiss him goodbye. I don't know that I would have been able to do this. Perhaps the desire to see him return, to have him back, even for one more day, would have continued to be too strong. Grandma Melina once told a story about a daughter whose father had died. The daughter loved her father so much that her heart was shattered into 100 pieces. When it came time to plan for the jubilant country wake, which was once held the night before all funerals, the daughter wanted no part of it and ordered that it not be held. "Daughter," said one of the wise old women in the daughter's village, "let the people rejoice at your father's wake tonight before they cry at his funeral tomorrow." "There will be no rejoicing," answered the daughter. "Why should I ever rejoice again when my father is dead?" "Daughter," insisted the old woman, "let the wake be held. Your father is now in the land between the water. Your father is now in the land beneath the waters. It is not our way to let our grief silence us." Knowing that the old woman had the gift that the ancestors granted to only a chosen few of being able to journey between the living and the dead, the daughter said to the old woman, "I will allow the wake to be held only if you go to the land beneath the waters and bring my father back." The old woman walked to the nearest river and slipped into the waters. A few hours later, she re-emerged and walked straight to the daughter's house. "Where's my father?" asked the daughter. "Daughter," said the old woman, "I am back from beneath the waters, deep into the bowels of the earth. There were some wide and narrow roads. I took them. There were many hills and mountains, and I climbed them. There were hamlets and villages and towns and cities, and I passed through them too. And finally, I reached the land of the ancestors, the city of the dead." "Did you see my father?" asked the daughter impatiently. "I saw so many people there I couldn't even tell you," answered the old woman. "I saw my mother and father, my uncle and grandmother, my aunt, who was trampled by a horse, and my sister who died of tuberculosis in childhood. All my loved ones who died were there." "Did you see my father?" shouted the daughter. "Daughter," answered the old woman, I looked and I looked amongst all those people until I found your father." "Where is he?" asked the daughter. "I've come to take you back to the land of the living." I told your father, "Your daughter's heart has broken into 100 pieces, and she cannot live without you." "What did he say to that?" asked the daughter. "I'm so touched that my daughter wants me to come back," he said, "but my home is now here in the land of the ancestors. Tell my daughter for me that when one is alive, but when one is dead, one is dead." The old woman then pulled from her pocket a set of false teeth that the father had religiously worn in his mouth when he was still among the living and had taken with him into the land of the dead. "Your father sent you this," said the old woman, "so that you might believe that I saw him and accept what he says." The daughter took the false teeth in her hands and looked at them with great sadness, but also but also with a new sense of courage. As my father wishes, so it shall be, she said. We will have the wake to honor him, to rejoice and celebrate his life before his body is put in the ground. We will eat, we will sing, we will we will dance and tell stories, but most importantly, we will speak of my father, for it is not our way to let our grief silence us. A few months after my father died, my parents' house caught fire. The fire started at 3 a.m. in the same room where my father had lain in bed for almost a year, in the corner where he once kept his emergency supply of several oxygen tanks. Given the nature of the fire, crackling in the walls, sparks in the ancient wiring, electricity, the fire marshal predicted that the entire house, which lost part of its roof and a few walls, could have been totally razed in 15 minutes. Enough time, thankfully, for my mother, my brother Carl, and his family, who'd moved in with my mother, to all quickly escape. But not enough time for my father, in the state he was in, to have gathered himself up and made his way out. He might not have even heard the hiss of spreading flames over the loud hum of his oxygen compressor, or seen the smoke beyond the ghostly faces that haunted his final nights. After my Uncle Joseph died, my father told me that he dreamed of him only once, and never in the small group he pictured around his bed. In my father's dream, when my uncle calls him from Maxwell's apartment the night he nearly died, my father actually makes it there on time to ride in the ambulance with him and hold his hands as the paramedics drill the tracheotomy hole in his neck. He must have been so scared, my father said, not knowing whether he was going to live or die. Like perhaps most people whose loved ones have died, I wish that I had some guarantees about the afterlife. I wish I were absolutely certain that my father and uncle are now together in some tranquil and restful place, sharing endless walks and talks beyond that they're too few and too short visits allowed. I wish I knew that they were offering enough comfort to one another to allow them to both not to remember their distressing, even excruciating last hours and days. I wish I could fully make sense of the fact that they're now sharing a gravesite and a tombstone in Queens, New York, after living apart for more than 30 years. In any case, every now and then I try to imagine them on a walk through the mountains of Beausejour. It's dawn, a dazzling morning over the green hills. The sun is slowly rising, burning through the fog. They are peacefully making their way down a zigzag trail that joins the villages to the rest of the world below. And in my imagining, whenever they lose track of one another, one or the other calls out in a voice that echoes throughout the hills, "Quote way off from, brother, where are you?" And the other one quickly answers, "Wen la, right here, brother. I'm right here."